Are far-right extremists using the cover of civil unrest after George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter protests as cover for their own violent actions to trigger a second civil war? I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And Bill, what I'm asking this morning comes from two different sources. One is an NPR interview I saw with a former deputy chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security, and the other is that trove of documents we talked about in a previous episode this week that are being publicized at theintercept.com that is called the BlueLeaks Trove, which came through a group called Distributed Denial of Secrets via Anonymous. I know that's very complicated, but I like to source these things. And basically, what they're both saying, both these back-channel communications from law enforcement officers, reports from the field, as well as Elizabeth Neumann, this former Homeland Security official, is that we are ignoring the role that far-right extremists are taking in violent acts, specifically shootings and Molotov cocktails and other kinds of attacks against police and citizens, because essentially we're on a political journey to make it all seem like it's nothing but Antifa. Bill, are you convinced that the Trump administration Justice Department is simply looking for the facts and the truth, or is it possible that they're pushing something that would make Joe Biden look worse in November?
It's actually, I don't want to say it's fun or even interesting. It's repellent, but it's clear to watch the narrative being constructed in front of your eyes. We just did a show called the Red Mirage. The idea that, sure, Trump may have a big win at the end of election night, but that doesn't mean he really won. There's all kinds of votes out there. And if it turns out that those votes came in and they aren't counted, then Trump stole the election. So you're preparing the narrative in advance. This is a case of not preparing the narrative in advance. This is the case of preparing a counter narrative, because the actual events as they unfold them was so catastrophically bad for Democrats and progressives that they are now in full-on damage control and panic mode. It wasn't conservatives that took to the streets and started smashing buildings, because it never is. After the death of George Floyd, it wasn't conservatives that were basically burning down universities to make sure that left-wing speakers didn't appear there. It wasn't conservatives doing any of these things. It was left-wingers, and it has been certainly since Donald Trump's presidency, a little bit before then. Occupy Wall Street wasn't right-wingers either. So basically what happens is this. The left produces these incidents of civil unrest because they perceive that a race war and a constant battle of America against itself is in their interests. And when these things start to go so big that the American people start paying attention, and then when the Democrats realize just how badly this is hurting them, then a counter-narrative has to be constructed. And the counter-narrative is, no, these are peaceful protests. It's those Trump supporters coming in that have made them violent. And if they think that's going to work, then they're entitled to their miserable opinion. But I think the American people have been so clear on this that they are in absolute panic now to do anything to distance themselves from what they started, what they encouraged, what they released, and what they promoted.
Well, Bill, the problem is here that the information that I'm telling you about is not coming from material that's designed for public consumption. In fact, it's information that was leaked from FBI documents, this BlueLeaks Trove, and it's law enforcement officers on the front lines essentially reporting that the most egregious acts of violence are really coming from far-right extremists. And now we're not talking about necessarily Trump supporters or even conservatives, but people who would be on the right rather than on the left. And that, in fact, there are far more of those, or that's a more intense and serious kind of crime than perhaps the vandalism that may be happening from the Black Lives Matter protesters. So these people weren't expecting they were putting out a press release. They were expecting they were communicating with the FBI about what's really happening on the ground.
It's a measure of just how much damage has been done to this country that I can remember a time when if you told me that the FBI reported out, I would have given it some confidence. I would have had some faith in it.
Well, again, Bill, the FBI is not reporting this. The FBI was concealing
I understand they're not
this,
reporting it.
And it got leaked.
I understand they're not reporting it. But anything that the FBI does now, in my opinion, is tainted and will remain so for the foreseeable future. But let's talk about the possibility that this evidence is there. once again, it's a question of who you're going to believe. These anonymous FBI leaks or your own lying eyes. Let's take a look at two examples that happened very recently. A Trump supporter was shot dead in Portland by a guy who says, I'm 100% Antifa. And he goes on to basically say, I'm proud of it and so on. He's been doing this kind of thing forever. And he just shot a Trump supporter dead and murdered him. Now, the counter story is the story of this guy who was walking down the street, and they claim he's just a right-wing white supremacist who just opened up on a crowd, and that he claimed he was acting in self-defense, but there's no evidence whatsoever to indicate that. Well, I've seen the video, and most of you have too. And to say that he was not acting in self-defense is nuts. He was being pursued by people that were smacking him and banging him on the head and probably would have killed him. So if you're telling me that this is an epidemic of people like white supremacists, right-wingers, walking out into a crowd of peaceful Antifa protesters and opening fire on them and killing them, while the peaceful Antifa protesters are just simply saying they're trying to protect their civil rights, I don't believe it. And I don't believe it because I've seen the evidence with my own eyes, and I hear what they have to say. Now, I'm not denying that there might be a couple of lunatics out there who maybe have had enough of this business of having their cities burned down and everything that they believe in torn down with impunity, and not only not stopped by the police, but encouraged by the police and glorified by the media. But to say that, but this is not the point, Scott. The point is that the construction of the narrative is what is essential. And the narrative now has to be, I'm seeing it everywhere. It's not just with this story from the FBI. I'm seeing it everywhere. Right-wing white supremacists are causing the violence in the streets, and it's Donald Trump's fault. And this is the level of desperation that these absolutely gutless, soulless, evil bastards have sunk to. And it's not going to stop. It's going to get worse between now and Election Day. And then after Election Day, things are going to get very ugly for a while.
Bill, forgive me for being an old school journalist. After all, I did go to college for that. But it seems to me that I'm not interested in what the narrative is. I want to know what's actually happening. And if it's possible that people in power, and as a journalism student, I was a little skeptical of people in power. If people in power are essentially crafting their narrative based on information that will make the other side look bad and ignoring or suppressing information about something that would make their side look bad, then we ought to know about that. Now, frankly, I don't think President Trump looks bad if people claiming to be far-right extremists or white supremacists do something evil, because he's a Republican, theoretically a conservative, or at least a lot of his supporters are. And he doesn't have to link himself with those people. But I don't see how the first thing you do is jump to this accusation about a narrative without saying, hey, is it possible that when law enforcement officers are reporting to the FBI that they're arresting far-right extremists, that may be a thing and that it should be at least mentioned in news accounts?
You dear sweet summer child. I remember when journalism was about reporting the news too. So when you say that just, no, people just interested in the news about what's actually going on, they don't have any interest in constructing an actual narrative, you're just wrong. And you've been wrong for a long time on this one, pretending to be wrong, acting wrong.
I'm not saying
anyway,
that they don't have an interest in constructing a narrative. I'm saying that police officers reporting who they arrested doesn't sound to me like somebody's PR agency constructing a narrative.
Yeah, well, no, but if you put it in that particular, if you want to put it in such a narrow box that there's no context around it, then I suppose you might have a point. But since that's not how the world works, you don't. There have been for the last 4 years, just to take an example of what you're talking about, how many times in the last 4 years have we seen Milo or Ben Shapiro or anybody else go to a college campus to give a speech and have people trash the buildings and storm the doors and threaten their lives and burn things and smash windows while the police stood around and watched? Now, if the police were arresting those people, and if the police were arresting the left-wing protesters that have been on the streets since the George Floyd thing, encouraged by the Democratic Party, and if arrests were being made on a constant basis of people that were breaking the law and smashing windows, then you would be able to say 6,492 left-wingers arrested, 5 right-wingers arrested. But if they're not going to arrest the left-wingers because they're under orders not to, and all they do is arrest the right-wingers, then you can say 5 right-wingers were arrested in these violent protests. No left-wingers were. My God, it's a white supremacist movement. It's very simple, really, and we can discuss this all day. We can have these arguments all day. It's the same thing with all of this stuff. It's a question of this. What do you see with your own eyes when you watch what's going on the streets of America? Are those Tea Party people that are burning down buildings? Those
No,
Tea Party
but people who are trying to advance, or as they would say, start the Boogaloo, are not Tea Party people. This is not the same group of people. This is not tarring.
Hold on.
Bill, let's be clear. We're not tarring your side of the aisle.
No. The Boogaloo has already been started. And this is the part of it that drives me absolutely insane. The Boogaloo has been started, and the Boogaloo started a long time ago. This is an example of the kind of thing where basically somebody is like, you're in the backseat of a car with your brother, and he starts poking you and 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 poking you. Finally he goes, stop! And then he goes, Mom, Billy hit me. That's what's going on here. And you have to invert everything that's happening on the ground in order to construct this story. And that's exactly what this is. When you start talking about the idea that this violence is caused by right-wing, forget right-wingers, let's just say it's the American Nazi Party starting all that they're claiming is responsible for this violence. It's just not true. I'm not saying that there weren't people who might have been arrested for that. What I am saying is that it wasn't the American Nazi Party, any right-wing organizations, white supremacists, or anything else that started this lawlessness in the streets of America. That was done by left-wing progressives. And the ability for it to continue was manifested by left-wing progressive mayors in New York and Los Angeles and in Portland and Seattle. And this sense of lawlessness has been going on for 3 or 4 months now. It's not only it's not only tolerated by these progressive mayors, it's encouraged by them. And after 3 months of it, the American people are sick of it, and they're going to vote every single one of these bastards out of office, and it's long overdue. And now they're in panic mode and trying to pin this on somebody other than themselves. So I'm not impressed by this. Is it possible, or even is it true, that there have been some right-wing people, some far-right extremists, some white nationalists maybe, or even Nazis involved in acts of violence? I suppose that is entirely possible. As a matter of fact, it's probably likely. But when you deal with the individual numbers of people that are doing that, and when they did it, you find two things. First of all, that the number of people involved on the right is microscopic compared to the number of people on the left. This is a left-wing phenomenon. And secondly, it was started by the left wing. It was started by violence in the streets. It was started by all of these things. And people's response to so-called right-wing terrorists and so on are a great example of that guy, or example of the McCluskeys, for example, who were called domestic terrorists because they came out onto the streets with their weapons, because they had the unbelievable temerity to think that maybe if they had their weapons with them, they may be able to defend their property or their lives. Turns out it was true, and that's why they had to be destroyed. So when you see the same media that is telling you this, and the same news sources and the same all of this crap, Scott, you can realize that you're being told a story by the same media that said there was no evidence. I forgot the name of the guy with the rifle in Portland. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was acting in self-defense. And all you have to do is just play the tape and look at it with your own two eyes and see that they're lying. So I'm not impressed by this argument. I am impressed by the effort that they're going to get out from underneath the consequences of their own actions. And that tells me that the American people have made a fundamental 1968 level tectonic shift away from the left, and that they are going to pay for it no matter how much they try to backpedal at this point.
At BillWhittle.com, we'll post links to the two stories that I used to set up the foundation of this episode so that you can check it out for yourself. We're grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com who've made this possible through their financial contributions to this enterprise. If you'd like to join them and find out what you're missing, go to BillWhittle.com and click that big green Become a Member button. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.